The desert wind carried stories that Benjamin Cross had stopped listening to years ago. Tales of loss and longing that seemed to settle into board his ranch house like dust, accumulating in corners where no amount of sweeping could reach them. At 71, Benjamin had learned that silence was the only companion that never disappointed, never left, and never asked for more than a man was willing to give. His ranch sat in a fold of New Mexico high desert where the land stretched endless and unforgiving toward horizons that shimmered with heat mirages and broken promises. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles east, and the town of Cedar Springs was a hard day's ride south through country that tested both horse and rider. It was exactly the kind of isolation that suited a man who had buried 2 wives, 3 children, and most of his faith in human nature beneath the harsh desert soil. The morning routine had become as automatic as breathing. Coffee black enough to wake the dead. Check the stock tank for water. Inspect a few head of cattle that still justified calling himself a rancher rather than just a hermit with property. Benjamin moved through these tasks with the mechanical precision of someone who understood that purpose, however small, was what separated the living from the merely surviving. It was while checking the fence line that ran along the old Indian Trail, a path that had been ancient when the first Spanish explorers stumbled across it, that Benjamin found her. At first, he thought it might be a bundle of discarded clothing caught against the wire, but as he drew closer, the bundle resolved into something that made his weather heart contract with recognition and concern. A young woman, perhaps 25, lay crumpled in the sparse shade of a fence post, her long black hair spread across the sandy ground like spilled ink. Apache, by the look of her, high cheekbones and the kind of features that spoke of bloodlines that had been walking this land since before memory. Her clothes were a mixture of traditional and practical, a cotton dress decorated with intricate beadwork that had probably taken months to complete, now torn and stained with the evidence of hard travel. Benjamin approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel and sage that carpeted the desert floor. The woman didn't move at his approach, but he could see the shallow rise and fall of her chest that indicated life, if not consciousness. Dehydration, exhaustion, and probably hunger. The classic trilogy that killed more people in the desert than bullets or snake bites ever had. "Ma'am," Benjamin said quietly, kneeling beside her with movements made careful by 7 decades of learning that sudden motions could mean the difference between help and harm. "You hurt." The woman's eyes opened slowly, dark brown pools that held depths Benjamin couldn't fathom but recognized as belonging to someone who had seen more of life's cruelties than any person should have to witness. She studied his face with the careful attention of someone whose survival had depended on reading the intentions of strangers, looking for signs of threat or deception in features that time and weather had carved into something resembling old leather. "Water," she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of absolute necessity. Benjamin nodded, reaching for the canteen he always carried during his morning rounds. He supported her head gently as she drank, noting how she controlled her desperation, taking only what she needed despite what was obviously considerable thirst. Apache training, he realized, learning to ration resources because survival in harsh country meant understanding that today's excess could mean tomorrow's death. "Easy now," Benjamin said as she tried to sit up too quickly. "You've been in the sun too long. Need to take things slow." The woman studied him again, her gaze moving from his weathered face to his hands, to the way he positioned himself to offer help without blocking her escape routes. Whatever she saw in his assessment seemed to satisfy her, because some of the tension left her shoulders and she allowed herself to lean back against the fence post. "Thank you," she said in careful English, her accent giving the familiar words a different rhythm that spoke a first language that had no relationship to European tongues. "How long have you been walking?" Benjamin asked, noting the condition of her moccasins, worn thin from travel over rough ground. 3 days, she replied. "Maybe 4. Time becomes difficult when there is only sun and walking." Benjamin calculated distances in his head, trying to determine where she might have started from to reach his ranch in that time frame. The nearest reservation was 60 miles north, but there were scattered settlements and trading posts throughout the territory where Apache families might be living legally or otherwise. "Where were you headed?" The woman was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much truth was safe to share with a white stranger who had shown her kindness but might yet prove dangerous. "Away," she said finally. "There was trouble. I needed to be somewhere else. It was answer enough. Benjamin had lived in the territory long enough to understand that trouble could mean anything from family disputes to government policies that changed with each new territorial administrator. Apache people had learned to be mobile, to disappear when staying meant danger for themselves or their families. Well, Benjamin said, rising slowly and extending his hand to help her up, my house isn't much, but it's got shade, food, and all the water you can drink. You're welcome to rest there until you figure out where somewhere else might be. The woman accepted his help standing, her movements careful but steady. Why? She asked, the question carrying the weight of someone who had learned that kindness from strangers usually came with prices that weren't immediately visible. Benjamin considered the question seriously, understanding that his answer would determine whether she trusted him enough to accept help or disappeared back into the desert to face whatever dangers had driven her to his fence line. Because, he said finally, it's the right thing to do, and because I got more room in that house than one old man knows what to do with. As they walked slowly toward the ranch buildings, Benjamin found himself thinking about the silence he'd cultivated so carefully over the years, the way it had become both comfort and curse. For the first time in longer than he cared to remember, he was looking forward to the sound of another person moving through his house, to conversation that went beyond talking to his animals and occasional visit from neighbors who stopped by more out of obligation than friendship. He had no way of knowing that his simple act of human decency was about to set in motion events that would challenge everything he thought he understood about justice, protection, and the kind of forces that could be awakened when someone threatened those under the care of people who remembered older laws than the ones written in territorial courthouses. The woman slept for 18 hours straight, curled on Benjamin's spare bed like a wild creature finally allowing itself to rest after days of hypervigilance. Benjamin found himself moving more quietly through his house than he had in years, conscious of another person's presence in ways that reminded him of the early days with Martha, when love had made him considerate of someone else's comfort before his own. When she finally emerged from the small bedroom, the afternoon sun was painting the desert in shades of gold and amber that seemed to restore some color to her face. She had braided her hair and somehow managed to repair the worst of the damage to her dress, transforming herself from a refugee into someone who carried herself with a quiet dignity that Benjamin recognized as belonging to people who refused to be broken by circumstances beyond their control. Better? Benjamin asked, looking up from the ledger where he'd been pretending to update accounts, while actually listening for signs that his unexpected guest was awake. Much better, she replied, moving to the window that looked out over the desert landscape. Your land is beautiful. Harsh, but beautiful. Been in my family 43 years, Benjamin said, following her gaze toward the distant mountains that marked the horizon. My father homesteaded it after the war, said he wanted space where a man could think without hearing his neighbor's business. And now you live here alone. It wasn't a question, and Benjamin understood that she'd read the signs. Too much space for one person. The careful way he prepared food for two as if he'd forgotten how to cook for just himself. The spare bedroom that was clean but clearly in use except for storage. Wife died 6 years ago, Benjamin said simply. Children never lived long enough to inherit anything but their graves. The woman nodded, understanding passing between them, without need for further explanation. Loss was a language that transcended cultural boundaries, and both of them had clearly learned to speak it fluently. I am called Star Who Walks, she said, offering her name as a gift of trust. Daughter of the Mescalero Apache, though I have not lived among my mother's people for many seasons. Benjamin Cross, he replied, and this is your home for as long as you need it to be. Over the following days, they settled into a rhythm that felt natural despite its strangeness. Star Who Walks proved to be a skilled cook, transforming Benjamin's basic supplies into meals that carried flavors he'd forgotten food could possess. She tended a small garden behind the house with knowledge that seemed to make plants grow better simply for her attention, and she moved through the ranch work with competence that suggested familiarity with cattle and horses despite her Apache heritage. Where did you learn to work with livestock? Benjamin asked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in colors that seemed too beautiful for a world that contained so much hardship. My husband was a mixed-blood man who worked for the territorial government, Star Who Walks replied, her voice carrying the careful neutrality that came when discussing painful subjects. He believed that Apache people needed to learn white ways to survive in the white world. He taught me many things. He died 3 months ago. Accident, the official said. Horse threw him into a canyon. Her voice remained steady, but Benjamin caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested the official story wasn't the only version of events. You don't believe it was an accident. Star Who Walks was quiet for a long time, watching the last light fade from the western sky. My husband had been investigating irregularities in government supply contracts. Food and blankets meant for reservation families that never arrived, money that disappeared between Washington and the tribal agencies. He had been asking questions that made important men uncomfortable. Benjamin felt something cold settle in his stomach as he understood what she was implying. Territorial politics were notoriously corrupt, and Apache accusations against government officials rarely received serious investigation, especially when those accusations threatened lucrative contracts or political careers. And you think someone decided he was too dangerous to let live. I think my husband forgot that being right about white men's crimes is often more dangerous than being wrong. Star Walks turned to face Benjamin directly, and I think that asking questions about his death could bring the same fate to anyone foolish enough to seek justice. Is that the trouble you were running from? Part of it, she admitted. After my husband died, certain men suggested that his widow should be grateful for their protection, should show her appreciation in ways that would ensure her continued safety. Benjamin's hands clenched into fists as he understood the full implications of what she was describing. They threatened you. They offered me a choice, Star Who Walks corrected. Accept their protection and the obligations that came with it, or face the same accident that had claimed my husband. The anger that rose in Benjamin's chest was hot and immediate, the kind of rage that had gotten him into trouble in his younger days. We'd been quick to reach for guns rather than words. But he was old enough now to understand that anger without plan was just noise, and Star Who Walks needed something more useful than his outrage. You're safe here, Benjamin said firmly. Whatever those men think they can do, they'll have to go through me first. Star Who Walks studied his face in the growing darkness, reading something there that seemed to satisfy her. You would fight for someone you barely know? I'd fight for what's right, Benjamin replied. And threatening women who've already lost their husbands is about as far from right as it gets. They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the desert, each lost in thoughts about the future that Benjamin's promise had just made more complicated. Star Who Walks had found sanctuary, but Benjamin understood that sanctuary only lasted as long as those who threatened it remained unaware of its location. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound carrying across the empty landscape, like a warning about the dangers that hunted in darkness. Benjamin had lived in the desert long enough to know that predators were patient, that they would circle their prey for days or weeks before striking, waiting for the moment when guards were down and escape routes were cut off. But he also knew that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. And looking at Star Who Walks silhouetted against the star-filled sky, Benjamin felt something awakening in his chest that he thought was buried with his family. The willingness to risk everything to protect someone who deserved better than the world was offering her. Word traveled fast in desert country, carried by traders and drifters who made their living moving between settlements with news that was worth more than silver to people hungry for information about the outside world. It took less than 2 weeks for rumors to reach Cedar Springs about the old rancher who was harboring an Apache woman, and less than 2 days after that for those rumors to transform into something darker and more dangerous. Benjamin first became aware of the changing mood when his weekly trip to town for supplies met with reactions that ranged from cold stares to open hostility. The general store that had served him faithfully for over a decade suddenly found reasons why certain items weren't available, and the saloon where he occasionally shared a drink with other ranchers grew quiet when he entered, conversations resuming only after he left. "Ben," said Tom Morrison, the closest thing Benjamin had to a friend in Cedar Springs, cornering him outside the bank with the uncomfortable expression of someone who'd drawn the short straw for delivering unwelcome news. "We need to talk." They walked to the edge of town, where the desert began and conversations could be held without curious ears recording every word. Morrison was a decent man, A fellow rancher who'd survived 40 years in the territory by understanding when to stand firm and when to bend with political winds that could destroy a man's livelihood overnight. "There's talk," Morrison said without preamble, "about you and the Apache woman you're keeping at your place." "What kind of talk?" Benjamin asked, though he could guess. "The kind that leads to torches and rope," Morrison replied grimly. "Folks are saying you're harboring a murderer, that she killed her husband and you're helping her escape justice." Benjamin felt his jaw clench with the effort of controlling his temper. Her husband was murdered, all right, but not by her. "That's not how Territorial Agent Garrett tells it," Morrison continued. "Says she killed her husband for his government salary, then fled before she could be arrested. Says any man who helps her is an accessory to murder." The name hit Benjamin like a physical blow. Howard Garrett was one of the territorial officials Starhawks had mentioned, a man whose wealth had grown remarkably during his tenure managing Apache affairs despite his modest government salary. If Garrett was spreading stories about Starhawks being a murderer, it meant he decided that she posed enough a threat to require elimination. "And people believe this?" Benjamin asked. "People believe what they want to believe," Morrison said sadly. "And right now, they want to believe that there's a simple explanation for the corruption that's been bleeding this territory dry. Blaming an Apache woman is easier than admitting that white officials have been stealing food from starving families." Benjamin absorbed this information, understanding that Starhawks was now facing not just a man who'd threatened her directly, but an entire community that had been convinced she was a dangerous criminal deserving whatever fate awaited her. "What do you suggest I do, Tom?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the conflict between friendship and self-preservation. "Turn her over to the territorial authorities," he said finally. "Let them sort out the truth. That way, you're not caught in the middle when things get ugly. And if the territorial authorities are the ones who murdered her husband, then she'll get the same justice that Apache people have always gotten from white courts," Morrison replied with brutal honesty. "But at least you'll still be alive to regret it." Benjamin rode home through country that suddenly felt less like sanctuary and more like a trap, understanding that his decision to help Starhawks had put them both in danger from enemies who controlled both the legal system and public opinion. The isolation that had once protected his privacy now meant that help was days away, and the nearest neighbors were more likely to join a lynch mob than oppose one. He found Starhawks waiting for him on the porch, her expression telling him that she'd read the news in his face before he'd even dismounted. "How bad?" she asked simply. "Bad," Benjamin admitted, settling into the chair beside her. "They're saying you murdered your husband, got half the territory, believing you're a dangerous criminal. And the other half? The other half doesn't care whether you're guilty or innocent. They just want an excuse to feel righteous about whatever they do to you." Starhawks nodded, accepting this assessment without surprise or self-pity. "How long do we have?" "Days. Maybe a week before someone works up the courage to organize a posse. Less if Garrett decides to make this official." They sat in silence as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, each understanding that they had reached a point where all choices carried consequences that couldn't be undone. Benjamin could still send Starhawks away, could claim he'd discovered her true nature and driven her off his land before learning the full extent of her crimes. It would probably save his life and his property, would restore his standing in a community where reputation was often the difference between prosperity and destruction. "There's another way," Starhawk said quietly, her voice carrying a note that made Benjamin look at her more closely. "What way?" "I could send word to my mother's people, the women of the warrior societies, the ones who remember the old laws about protecting those who cannot protect themselves." Benjamin felt something cold settle in his stomach as he understood what she was suggesting. "That would mean war." "Not war," Starhawks corrected. "Justice. The kind that doesn't depend on courts that have already decided the verdict before hearing the evidence." "How many would come?" Starhawk smiled for the first time since he'd known her, and the expression transformed her face into something fierce and beautiful that reminded Benjamin why Apache warriors had been feared throughout the Southwest for generations. "All of them," she said simply. "Every woman who remembers what it means to stand for those who cannot stand for themselves." As darkness settled over the desert and the first stars appeared in the vast sky above them, Benjamin understood that he was about to become part of something larger than his own life, something that would challenge everything the territory thought it knew about power, justice, and the kind of forces that could be awakened when ordinary people decided they'd had enough of being victims. Tomorrow would bring decisions that couldn't be undone, choices between the safety of compromise and the danger of standing for principles that might be worth dying for. But tonight, sitting beside a woman who trusted him with her life and her secrets, Benjamin Cross felt more alive than he had since the day he'd buried his last family member in the unforgiving desert soil. The message went out on the third night, carried by a wind that seemed to know exactly where it needed to go. Star Who Walks had used signal fires built in the old way, flames and smoke arranged in patterns that would be invisible to white eyes but clear as written words to those who remember the ancient languages of desert communication. Benjamin watched her work with the fascination of someone witnessing skills that had been passed down through generations of women who understood that survival sometimes required summoning forces that civilization had forgotten. How long? Benjamin asked as they watched the last of the signal fires burn down to coals that would be scattered and hidden before dawn. 3 days, Star Who Walks replied with the certainty of someone who understood exactly what she had set in motion. Maybe 4 if the weather turns bad. But they will come. All of them. Every woman who can ride. Every girl old enough to sit a horse and carry a weapon. From the Mescalero, from the Chiricahua, from bands whose names white men have never learned to pronounce. Star Who Walks turned to face Benjamin in the darkness, her eyes reflecting starlight like polished obsidian. You asked for my story, Benjamin Cross. Tomorrow, you will see what happens when Apache women decide that story has gone on long enough. The next morning brought visitors of a different sort. A delegation from Cedar Springs led by Territorial Agent Garrett himself, riding up to Benjamin's ranch with the kind of official authority that was backed by badges and bullets. Garrett was a soft man made dangerous by position and circumstance, the kind of bureaucrat who'd learned that power could compensate for physical weakness if applied with sufficient ruthlessness. Mr. Cross, Garrett called from horseback, his voice carrying the false friendliness of someone who'd already decided how this conversation would end. I believe you have something that belongs to the territorial government. Benjamin emerged from his house with Star Who Walks beside him, both of them moving with the careful dignity of people who understood they were probably about to die, but refused to make it easy for their killers. Can't say I'm holding any government property, Agent Garrett, unless you've come to reclaim the taxes I've paid over the years. Don't be clever, Cross. You're harboring a fugitive from justice, a woman wanted for the murder of her husband and theft of government funds. Hand her over, and we'll overlook your role in helping her evade capture. And if I don't, Garrett's smile was cold as winter wind, then you'll be charged as an accessory to murder and dealt with accordingly. Your choice, but choose quickly. My patience isn't unlimited. Benjamin looked at the men arranged behind Garrett. A dozen hard cases who wore badges but carried themselves like hired guns, the kind of men who'd shoot a woman in the back and call it justice if the price was right. Star Who Walks stood beside him with quiet courage, ready to face whatever came, but unwilling to run anymore. Well, Benjamin said finally, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip, I reckon my answer is that Star Who Walks is under my protection, and anybody who wants to harm her is going to have to go through me first. The silence that followed was broken by the sound every experienced frontiersman learned to recognize, the thunder of many horses approaching at speed across hard ground. But this wasn't the organized clatter of cavalry or the random noise of a cattle drive. This was something else entirely, a rhythm that spoke of riders who moved as one entity, whose horses had been trained for war rather than transportation. They appeared on the horizon like a dream made manifest, flowing across the desert landscape with the fluid precision of a force of nature. Hundreds of them, mounted on horses that moved like dancers, their riders carrying themselves with the kind of confidence that came from knowing they were exactly where they belonged, doing exactly what they'd been born to do. At their head rode a woman whose presence seemed to command the very air around her, tall, proud, with silver hair that flew behind her like a banner and eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of 70 winters spent learning when to make war and when to make peace. She carried a lance decorated with eagle feathers and strips of leather that told stories Benjamin couldn't read, but somehow understood. 400, Star Who Walks said quietly, pride and love evident in her voice. 400 women who remember what it means to protect their own. Garrett's men had gone pale at the sight of the approaching force. Their hands moving toward weapons they suddenly understood would be woefully inadequate against what was descending upon them. This wasn't a raiding party or a group of renegades. This was an army, organized and disciplined and utterly without fear of the consequences their presence might bring. The lead rider brought her horse to a stop 50 yards from Benjamin's porch, close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid seeming threatening despite the obvious military nature of her force. When she spoke, her voice carried easily across the distance, clear and strong and filled with the kind of authority that didn't need badges or titles to command respect. I am Red Cloud Woman, keeper of the warrior traditions, speaker for those who have no voice in white man's courts, she announced, her English precise despite the accent that marked it as a carefully learned second language. I have come for my daughter, and for justice that has been too long delayed. Agent Garrett found his voice, though it came out higher and less steady than he'd probably intended. This is territorial business, woman. You have no authority here. Red Cloud Woman's laugh was like the sound of wind through canyon walls, ancient, musical, and somehow terrifying in its complete lack of concern for the threats implied in Garrett's words. Authority? She repeated, gesturing toward the hundreds of mounted women arrayed behind her in perfect formation. I have all the authority I need, white man. The authority of mothers protecting their children, of women who refuse to let their daughters be murdered by cowards who hide behind badges. She urged her horse forward until she was close enough that Benjamin could see the intricate tattoos that marked her face and hands, symbols that spoke of honors earned and enemies defeated in battles that had shaped the history of the southwestern desert. Benjamin Cross, Red Cloud Woman said, switching her attention to him. You protected one of ours when you had no obligation to do so, when doing so brought danger to your own life. For this, you have earned something that cannot be bought or stolen, the respect of the Apache Nation. Just did what seemed right, Benjamin replied, understanding that he was participating in something far more significant than a simple conversation. What seems right to one person often seems dangerous to those who profit from wrong, Red Cloud Woman observed, her gaze shifting back to Garrett and his men. But today, those who profit from wrong will learn what happens when they threaten those under Apache protection. The standoff stretched like a wire drawn to breaking point. For 100 Apache women facing a dozen territorial agents in a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Star Who Walks, but the future balance of power in a territory where might had always trumped right. Benjamin found himself at the center of forces he barely understood, watching as two very different concepts of justice prepare to collide in the dust of his ranch yard. Agent Garrett tried to maintain his authority, despite the obvious impossibility of his situation. This is illegal assembly, he declared, his voice carrying less conviction than desperation. I order you to disperse immediately or face the consequences. Red Cloud Woman's response was to raise her lance, a signal that brought a sound like controlled thunder as 400 women drew weapons in perfect unison. Bows strung with arrows that could punch through armor, war clubs decorated with eagle feathers and human hair, rifles that had been taken from soldiers who'd learned too late that underestimating Apache women was a fatal mistake. The only consequences here will be yours if you attempt to harm this woman, Red Cloud Woman replied, her voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that came from someone who'd made peace with whatever violence might be required. Star Who Walks is under our protection. You will not touch her. She's a murderer, Garrett protested, but his voice cracked like a boy's calling across a playground where the other children had suddenly grown too large and dangerous to intimidate. She is a widow whose husband was killed for trying to expose your crimes, Red Cloud Woman corrected. And you are a thief who steals food from starving children and calls it government service. The truth of the accusation hit Garrett like a physical blow, and Benjamin could see him calculating whether he had enough men to fight his way out of a situation that spiraled completely beyond his control. But even a corrupt bureaucrat could count to 400, and the women arrayed against him showed no sign of being impressed by badges or territorial authority. This isn't over, Garrett said finally, recognizing that retreat was his only option for survival. The territorial governor will hear about this. The army will do what armies always do, Red Cloud Woman interrupted. They will kill women and children and call it victory. But first, they will have to find us. And Apache women know places where armies cannot follow, where we can wait for justice to take its course. She turned her attention back to Benjamin, her expression softening slightly as she addressed someone who'd proven himself worthy of respect. You have given sanctuary to one of ours when you had no obligation to do so. This creates bonds that do not break with time or distance. From this day forward, you are under Apache protection. What does that mean? Benjamin asked. It means that any harm that comes to you will be answered as if it were harm done to our own blood. Star Who Walks explained, moving to stand beside Red Cloud Woman's horse. It means you are no longer alone in this world. And it means, Red Cloud Woman added with a smile that transformed her weathered face into something approaching grandmotherly affection, that you now have 400 daughters who will remember your kindness in their prayers and their stories until the last Apache woman draws breath. As the territorial agents began their retreat, Garrett called back one final threat. This won't stand, Cross. The territorial government won't tolerate this kind of defiance. Red Cloud Woman's laugh followed them across the desert like an echo of ancient storms. Let them come, she called after the fleeing men. Let them learn what happens when cowards try to wage war on grandmothers. As the dust settled and the immediate crisis passed, Benjamin found himself surrounded by Apache women who dismounted and began making camp around his ranch with the efficiency of people who'd been preparing for this moment their entire lives. They moved like water flowing into available spaces, setting up temporary shelters, tending to horses, starting fires for the evening meal. How long will they stay? Benjamin asked Star Who Walks as they watched the organized chaos of 400 women transforming his isolated ranch into something resembling a small city. Until the threat passes, she replied. Until Agent Garrett and men like him understand that Apache women are not victims to be terrorized, but warriors to be respected. And then I will have choices I haven't had since my husband died, Star Who Walks said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been hope. I can return to my mother's people, or find a new place in a world that suddenly seems larger than it did this morning. Or, Benjamin said quietly, surprising himself with his boldness, you could stay here, help an old rancher figure out what to do with more space than one person needs. Star Who Walks looked at him with eyes that seemed to see directly into his soul, reading intentions and possibilities that he was only beginning to understand himself. Are you certain that's what you want? A life complicated by Apache politics and territorial officials who will never forgive this day. Benjamin looked around at the scene unfolding in his yard. Women sharing food and stories. Children playing games that had been old when the first Europeans arrived in the Americas. Horses grazing peacefully in pastures that had been empty of human laughter for too many years. I'm certain that the last month has been the most alive I've felt since I buried my family, Benjamin said honestly. And I'm certain that whatever comes next, I'd rather face it with someone I trust than face it alone. As evening settled over the desert and the Apache women began their nightly ceremonies of gratitude and remembrance, Benjamin Cross realized that his simple act of kindness toward a desperate stranger had transformed him from a lonely hermit into something he'd never expected to become again. A man with a family, a community, and a future worth protecting. The territorial government would indeed send armies, would attempt to restore what they called order to a situation that had challenged their authority in ways they couldn't ignore. But that would be tomorrow's problem. Tonight, under a sky full of stars that seemed to approve of justice finally being demanded, Benjamin allowed himself to believe that some battles were worth fighting, some stands were worth taking, and some kinds of love were strong enough to survive whatever forces might be arrayed against them. In the distance, coyotes called each other across the empty landscape, but their voices were answered now by the songs of Apache women, who remembered when the desert had belonged to those who understood how to live in harmony with its harsh beauty. It was a sound that spoke of homecoming, of justice delayed but not denied, of the kind of strength that could only be summoned when people decided they'd had enough of being afraid. And in that sound, Benjamin Cross heard the echo of his own transformation from a man who tried to bury his past in silence into someone who discovered that the future was worth fighting for, especially when you didn't have to fight for it alone.